Yes, I think maybe we can start. Good morning to those hardy souls who are here, and our speaker and our guests. It's great to see everybody on particularly rough day weather-wise. Today we have the benefit. It's a very great pleasure to welcome Craig Mokhiber. He is the director of the Human Rights Office at the UN, which is remarkable that we're able to get him as a speaker today, but we're certainly glad he's here, especially given the difficult weather conditions. So he's going to give us a talk about his work. And we're going to have a somewhat streamlined service. And I think Patty probably will have some closing music for us, but otherwise I don't think we'll be using the musical arrangements that were in the program. So in any case, Mr. Mokhiber, perhaps you could come up and join us, and any remarks you care to make, and if you want to do a Q&A at the end or whatever you want to do, we're prepared to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Very nice to be back here. Thank you very much for the invitation. I spoke here, gosh, it's got to be a year or two ago now, and I really appreciated the conversation. And indeed, I'll be very happy to have a Q&A afterwards if folks are still interested. I was given a very challenging task here, which is to speak for about 15 minutes and to cover in that my journey as a human rights defender, the war in Ukraine, assaults on democracy. So I'm going to do my very best not to. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me to this conversation in this really beautiful and historic church with its noble history. And as this is a human rights discussion, and it is Thanksgiving week, I'd like to also begin by honoring the traditional stewards of this land who were displaced and dispossessed by successive waves of French and British and American colonialism across the Niagara region, including the Ongayara, the Atuk-Andarunk, Seneca, and Tuscarora peoples. I was asked by Joe and by the organizers to talk a bit about my experience in serving as a human rights lawyer and as a United Nations human rights official over the past 3 decades, and then to say something about the war in Ukraine, including the parts of the story I was asked that might not make their way into media accounts here. And finally, I was asked to speak a bit about the rising threats to freedom and democracy in this country and beyond. So let me start with that first piece and say that I have been active in the international human rights movement for actually over 40 years now, because I marked my entry into that movement at the moment when, as a freshman at Buffalo State College, I picked up a sign and marched in a demonstration against US-supported apartheid in South Africa. For me, this led to a decade of justice activism in Buffalo and beyond. And the last 31 years of my life in this movement has been spent at the United Nations, in New York, in Geneva, in Palestine, in Afghanistan, and in dozens of countries all around the world. But for me, this calling was actually rooted in my experiences right here in Niagara Falls. I grew up in a working class family in Niagara Falls in the 1960s and 70s. When I was born in 1960, the city was at its peak. The population had grown to well over 100,000. The economy was booming. The New Deal was still in effect. Good union jobs were available for the asking. Public education was well funded. And the human rights movement led by African Americans here in Niagara Falls and across the country was gathering steam and would soon see the formal dismantling of Jim Crow here in the United States, even if its remnants continue to haunt African American lives to this day. I graduated from the first ever class of Head Start, part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. But just as the forces of progress had gathered, so too were the forces of reaction gathering. Corporate greed, government corruption, racist backlashes. Niagara Falls, beginning in my teen years and beyond, became increasingly economically depressed, racially divided, environmentally degraded, and dramatically unequal. Chemical companies ruthlessly exploited the land, the air, the water, and the people of Niagara Falls. And then they turned on a dime and abandoned the city, leaving behind scarred and polluted neighborhoods and economic hopelessness. So-called urban renewal displaced poor and working families, erased whole communities, crushed small business, and bottomed out the local economy. Government was corrupted by the corporations. Labor unions corrupted by the mafia. Lives were turned upside down by the Love Canal and Bloody Run disasters, and then accelerated deindustrialization and unconstrained capital mobility. And a toxic new economic ideology, since called neoliberalism, was about to be unleashed on this city and on the country, ending the New Deal, gutting the social safety net, privatizing economic gains in the hands of a privileged few, and socializing losses across the broader public. Niagara Falls was in rapid decline, as borne out by spiking indicators of joblessness, disease, mortality, crime, drug dependency, depression, and despair. So I didn't need to look very far to see what happens when institutions in both the public and the private sphere focus not on the needs and rights of people, not on freedom from fear and freedom from want for the many, but rather on the accumulation and consolidation of the wealth and power of the few. Now, I know what you're thinking. We invite this guy here to talk about human rights, and he makes a speech about Niagara Falls. But I do so for two reasons. First, because, as has often been said, human rights begin at home. They do not exist in some amorphous international sphere somewhere out there. They're not a concern of only war-torn or poor countries. Rather, they are universal in their existence and in their violation. And it is at home that rights are either realized or violated. So later in the 1980s, as a student and activist in Buffalo, I discovered that the same disregard for the dignity of human beings that I saw here at home was also manifest in our own nation's foreign policy abroad, where our government was openly supporting apartheid in South Africa, persecution in Palestine, death squads in Central America, and brutal wars all across the globe. And I saw that much of the media was either silent or directly complicit in covering up or justifying the crimes of our government committed in our name. But I was learning something else as well. The power of social movements, of public interest law, and of human rights to push back against these assaults on dignity, and sometimes to actually turn the tide. At UB Law School, under the mentorship of a renowned human rights law professor named Virginia Leary, and following the models of great lawyers like Ralph Nader and William Kunstler, I learned how human rights law and its potential for countering abuses of power in both the public and the private spheres. It turned out that there was this universal legal framework. It was called international human rights law, and it applied to every person in every country, including ours. It enumerated and obliged governments to protect all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights for all people without discrimination on the basis of race, sex, language, religion, political opinion, or any other status. In other words, a whole body of law designed not to protect the powerful, as much law is designed to do, but rather to protect the people, including the most marginalized, the most excluded and despised among them. That was a revelation for me. I had spent much of the 1980s, when I wasn't studying or tending bar to pay my rent, marching on the Pentagon or Ronald Reagan's White House or Jimmy Griffin's City Hall in Buffalo. This was an age of chronic police violence, the time of the .22 caliber killer hunting down Black men across the region, a time of rapid deregulation, privatization of public resources, and government-supported union busting. Economic and social rights were under assault in this country. Civil and political rights were on the defensive. Some people were fighting back, and I wanted to be a part of that. Now, of course, protests and demonstrations are great for raising awareness and for feeling that surge of solidarity that comes when people fighting against injustice band together. But then you go home and the pattern of abuse continues. Law, I thought, could give teeth to our calls for justice. And human rights law was the field that offered the most hope of challenging power. So I continued on to law school, not to secure a place in defending the status quo, but rather to learn how to challenge it. And rather than spending my law school summer clerkships at a law firm, I spent the first summer monitoring human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories during the first Intifada. And the second summer at the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva, Switzerland, doing analysis of human rights under states of emergency and post-Tiananmen China in apartheid South Africa and in occupied Palestine. That was the beginning for me of more than 3 decades at the UN Human Rights Program, a career that would give me a front row seat for the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of apartheid in South Africa, Cambodia's escape from the horrors of the killing fields, and a wave of democratization across Eastern Europe and Africa. But also a view of genocide in Rwanda and in Bosnia and in Myanmar, continued massacres and systematic oppression in Palestine, Darfur, Afghanistan, Colombia, and beyond. In each case, we were there under the blue UN flag, carrying out human rights diplomacy, advocacy, monitoring, investigations, technical assistance and training, and institution building, all for the purpose of securing accountability for perpetrators, redress for victims, protection for the vulnerable, empowerment for rights holders, and building capacities for duty bearers so that rights might actually be realized. And we were pressing for recognition that things like education and healthcare and housing and water and sanitation and social security are rights to which all are entitled without discrimination, not mere commodities for sale to those who can afford them, or privileges that you had to be born into. To argue that security must be defined and pursued from the perspective of the human security of the person, not through the archaic and dangerous lens of so-called state security or the security of a wealthy and powerful elite. That killings and torture and kidnapping and renditions and mass surveillance and arbitrary detention are not legitimate acts when carried out by the state in the name of security or in the name of counterterrorism, but rather they are assaults on security. They are terrorism. To push back against the stubborn concept of the other, whether minorities or migrants or Muslims or indigenous people or the poor or any other group, a concept that when exploited by opportunistic politicians and a complicit media, inevitably opens the door to racism and bigotry and profiling and persecution, and ultimately, even today, genocide. And to move beyond a conception of sovereignty that views it as a brick wall around the borders of the state, within which the state is free to do whatever it wants to its own people, up to including war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide. That's what this work is all about, the idea that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that all people, wherever they are, whoever they are entitled to freedom from fear and freedom from want without discrimination. And that I have the right to be protected from the government who would oppress me, from the criminal who would extort me, from the police officer who would kneel on my neck until I die, or the corporation that would poison my water or the climate. That I equally have right to be free from the fear that somebody will hijack an airplane, crash it into the building, and kill me. But also to be free from the fear that the government will break down my door in the middle of the night, put me in an orange jumpsuit, and throw me in a dungeon on a Caribbean island because it doesn't like my religion or my race or my political opinion or my criticisms of its activities. Now, of course, all of this is easier said than done, because this work has meant struggling with all of the old problems of the last century. None of those have gone away. Racism and colonialism and apartheid and genocide and torture and slavery and hunger and untreated disease, all of these are still with us. But layered on top of them are the new challenges of this century. Abuses of technology, mass surveillance, the ravages of climate change, challenges of population aging, gross inequalities, economic and otherwise. This is a multi-layered fight for human dignity now. One of the biggest challenges to it is, of course, war. And I want to address the question about the war in Ukraine. I was asked to talk a little bit about that with a focus on things that we might not be hearing so much about. It's a difficult conversation to have because, of course, we all want to be in solidarity with the victims of war. And I am in solidarity with the people of Ukraine in this regard. But they say that Americans learn geography through war. Today, Americans are learning about places like Kyiv, the Donbass, Luhansk, Donetsk, Mariupol, Kherson, and Crimea, and also relearning about places in Russia, like Moscow and St. Petersburg. The people of Ukraine are suffering today from assaults on their dignity as human beings, killing, torture, destruction, just as the people of Palestine and Yemen and Syria and Ethiopia and a dozen other places are suffering these assaults. Remember that the UN was founded on the ashes of the Second World War for the express purpose to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Its charter prohibits acts of aggression, and its human rights treaties forbid the assaults on human dignity that accompany war. And the Geneva Conventions, adopted in 1949, establish binding rules of conduct for instances when war nevertheless occurs. The problem is that the winners of World War II, in drafting the UN Charter, wrote in an exception for themselves through the Security Council veto that effectively exempts them from UN enforcement power. And 2 of the 5 countries that were granted this privilege, the United States and Russia, have repeatedly used the veto to shield themselves and their allies from accountability for breaches of the peace, of humanitarian law, and of human rights. That's why the UN has been unable to stop unlawful US aggression and war crimes in places like Vietnam and Iraq, just as it's been unable to stop Russian aggression in the Ukraine. But the UN is nevertheless active in Ukraine with constant efforts at diplomacy, at delivering humanitarian aid, carrying out human rights monitoring and advocacy, facilitating food and fertilizer shipments out of the region to the poor countries of the global south. Our human rights team has been on the ground since 2014 and is monitoring violations and intervening to try to provide protection wherever we can. From 24 February 2022, when Russia began its armed attack against Ukraine, to this month, we have recorded 16,631 civilian casualties in the country, 6,557 civilians killed, 10,074 injured, men, women, and children. And these are only the verified cases. The actual figures are actually much, much higher. Most of the civilian casualties recorded were caused by shelling from heavy artillery, multiple rocket launch systems, missiles, and airstrikes. Some have been transferred or deported to Russia in violation of international humanitarian law. Ukrainian prisoners of war in the hands of Russia have been beaten, had their personal belongings pillaged, packed into overcrowded trucks or buses, and denied access to water or toilets for more than a day. Their hands tied and their eyes covered so tightly with duct tape that it cuts into the skin. Upon arrival at place of internment, prisoners are subjected to so-called admission procedures, which involve prolonged beatings, threats, dog attacks, being stripped and put into stress positions. Prisoners of war have been beaten with batons and wooden hammers, kicked and given electric shocks with tasers and with a military phone known as TAPIC. They're held in overcrowded cells, poor hygiene, lack of food and water. Some of them have lost up to a quarter of their body weight, and many frequently faint in captivity. What you may not have heard at the same time is that prisoners of war held by the government of Ukraine have also been subjected to summary executions, beatings, torture, and ill treatment by the Ukrainian forces. Russian prisoners of war were punched and kicked in the face and body after surrendering. Some were stabbed or given electric shocks, also with the TAPIC military phone. They've been held in humiliating conditions during evacuation to transit camps and places of internment. Often naked, they're packed into trucks or minivans with their hands tied behind their backs. Many of these Russian prisoners received so-called welcome beatings by Ukrainian forces and have been held in extended internment in inhuman, informal places of detention, in the basements of guardhouses and military headquarters. The horrors of war do not discriminate. So we're witnessing a war that started with the supreme war crime by Russia, that of aggression, and that has since been characterized by further war crimes and human rights violations by both Russia and Ukraine. How do we understand this? Just war theory, which underpins international law, considers such situation through the lens of 2 concepts, jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum refers to the legality of the justification for going to war in the first place. And here it's clear. Aggression violates the UN Charter, is always illegal, and is always to be condemned, whether Russian aggression in Ukraine or aggression in Palestine, Yemen, Iraq, Vietnam. Thus, as to the reason for going to war, Russia is guilty of aggression, breaching the concept of jus in bellum. While Ukraine, acting in legitimate self-defense, is engaged in a legitimate military action under this theory because it's defending itself. Simply put, Russia had no right to invade and Ukraine has a legitimate right to resist. But the second half of the analysis, use in bello, relating to the conduct of all forces during the conduct, relates to the conduct of all forces during the conflict. Here we see war crimes being committed by both sides. This is not to engage in moral equivalencies or both sidesism. Russia is accountable for launching the war. But human rights and international humanitarian law are not principally concerned with states or about picking sides in a conflict. Rather, they're concerned about the dignity and well-being of civilians on both sides and about the treatment of captured or injured soldiers on both sides. So beyond the act of aggression itself, Russia has undeniably been responsible for thousands of civilian casualties, the destruction of civilian architecture, illegal annexation of territory, unlawful deportations, torture, and detention abuses. And our reports indicate that Ukraine too has also perpetrated war crimes, including killings, beatings, torture, and detention abuses. Now, some of this we have heard in the substantial Western media coverage that has accompanied this war. But I was asked today to talk about some aspects that are less talked about, like the fact that Ukraine is in fact involved in not one war, but really three: Russia's war of aggression, a geopolitical war between Russia and the US, and a simmering civil war between the center of Ukraine and the minority provinces to the east. So while Russia and Ukraine are the direct combatants in this conflict, they're not the only parties to it. The US and its NATO allies have poured billions of dollars of military aid, constant intelligence support, and diplomatic effort into the war. It's therefore important that we look clearly at the role of our own government in bringing about and sustaining this conflict. It's not easy to do in this climate, but if the first casualty of war is the truth, nuance is always the second casualty. Obscured by the official US narrative is the fact that this war might have been averted entirely, and how the policies and actions of our own country may have helped to bring the war about. The media here has given little space to the fact that the US knew from its own experts and diplomats that its efforts to expand NATO, a military alliance hostile to Russia, right up to the borders of Russia, especially in Ukraine, and in spite of the historic US promises to Russia that it would not do so, was a provocation that would almost certainly bring a strong response from Russia. It has said nothing about US efforts to destabilize the country or to support the overthrow of the elected Ukrainian presidency in 2014 in the wake of the Maidan demonstrations, or of the leaked audio of State Department officials, Victoria Nuland and other US officials supporting the protests and actively planning for the replacement of the pro-Russian or neutral leaders with pro-Western figures. It barely mentions that the 2014 Maidan demonstrations that started out peacefully and with reasonable demands for neutrality and closer ties to Europe was then overtaken by violent extreme right ethno-nationalist forces, which attacked the government and demonized the ethnic Russian minorities in the East. It says nothing of Ukraine then shelling the Donbas region dominated by the Russian minority Ukrainians with US weapons since 2014. Nor do we hear about the actual historic ties and pro-Russian sentiments of the people of Crimea, or the long-standing persecution and discrimination in Ukraine against the Russian minority in these regions. And we've seen the silencing of any effort to point out that Ukraine really does have a Nazi problem. Of course, Russia itself has a problem with far-right extremists, and surprise, surprise, so does the United States. The difference is that the Nazis in Ukraine actually have influence in the government, and that Nazi contingents, like the officialized, influential Azov battalion, are actually incorporated in the Ukrainian military and war effort, complete with their Nazi insignias and posters of World War II pro-Nazi leader Stefan Bandera. And remember, the Russians lost 27 million people to the Nazis in World War II. If they seem overly sensitive to this, you can understand why. Of course, this does not make Ukraine a Nazi country, as President Putin has sometimes tried to suggest. And it does not in any way relieve Russia of its accountability for aggression and other war crimes in Ukraine. Indeed, Russia must be held accountable. But denying these essential truths obscures the causes and complexities of the conflict and makes it harder to see solutions and to find a path to peace. Now, to be clear, Ukraine's President Zelensky, who is himself Jewish, is no lover of the Nazis. And he actually tried to challenge and disempower the Azov Battalion and other Nazi groups after he was elected on a platform of making peace with the eastern provinces. Sadly, their influence was too great and he failed to do so, and they therefore remain a real threat. This has always been well known to US officials, so much so that during his time in office, US President Obama refused to send arms to Ukraine explicitly because he didn't want those arms to fall into the hands of groups like Azov. And now they have those weapons. We should be asking ourselves, what could this mean for a peaceful future in Ukraine and Europe? Nor do we hear much about the effects of the militarization of Ukraine and the militarization of Europe that's happening as a result of this war. We're seeing massive military spending at a moment of massive unmet civilian needs in Ukraine, in Europe, in the global South, and right here in the United States. $80 million alone for weapons, enough to forgive all medical debt in the United States. Sorry, 80 billion with a B. This is a moment of widespread hunger, poverty, homelessness, and still no right to healthcare in the US. Few are thinking seriously enough about the real threat of nuclear war in this continuously escalating proxy war between two countries with the largest nuclear arsenals on Earth. And the recent explosion of rockets across the border in Poland, a NATO state, should illustrate the dangers of error in these circumstances. Ukraine, while never formally admitted, has been a de facto member of NATO since 2015. In this insecure climate, others have rushed to join NATO, even historically neutral states like Sweden and Finland. European military budgets across the continent are swelling. Some have called for a no-fly zone, which in practice would mean direct US and NATO military action against Russia. One small step from World War III. Ask yourself, who benefits from this terrible situation? Well, the weapons industry is registering record profits. So too is the oil industry, while Ukrainians are dying in their thousands. The resulting global food crisis risks starving millions in the global South, especially in Africa. And the war is causing massive environmental and climate damage with transnational implications. And still, the call for diplomacy, for negotiations, and for peace is a whisper challenging a roar of militarism. Remember, most wars ultimately end in one of two ways, either in total destruction or in a negotiated solution. But the stubborn myth of a military solution dies hard, even after the bloody debacle of Iraq, even after the disaster of Libya. And few have learned the lessons of the war in Syria, where a series of successive peace plans were rejected by all sides, as all sides chose the possibility of victory over the possibility of peace. In the end, it was the people of Syria who lost everything, not those, including our own country, who were dropping the bombs. Some in the West have openly sought a drawn-out proxy war to drain and destabilize Russia and weaken Putin. But this would be at the expense of the Ukrainian people, because a proxy war always destroys the host. In these situations, we don't need more escalation. We need to find a way to silence the drums of war. We need a ceasefire. We need a negotiated solution. We need a durable peace. And it is possible. There is a framework for peace. Already in 2014 and 2015, we saw the agreement of the Minsk Accords facilitated by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, securing a peace based on a Ukrainian ceasefire, demilitarized buffer zones, neutrality, autonomy in the Donbass, and minority rights. The UN Security Council approved these accords back in 2015, and the US voted in favor of them. But they've been scuttled first by slow implementation and since by the Russian invasion. This track must be brought back to life for the sake of peace. It must be supplemented by reparations for the Ukrainian people, guarantees for their security, accountability for perpetrators of war crimes, redress for victims, and the full protection of minority rights. There's one more impact of this war about which we hear little, and this is the impact on Russian civilians. Now, to be clear, they are not suffering what Ukrainian civilians are suffering, as no bombs are falling on Russian cities. But they are enduring the harmful effects of sanctions on their access to food and to healthcare and so on. Those brave enough to speak out against the war are subjected to often brutal repression by a regime that tolerates little dissent. And here in the West, we see growing Russophobia as well. One final point on Ukraine. It is very heartening to see the warm reception that the West is offering to Ukrainian refugees. It's encouraging to hear the firm rejection of Russian aggression, of the forced annexation or foreign occupation, of acquisition of territory by force. It's encouraging to see the strong affirmation of the Ukrainian right to resist, the demands for accountability for violations of human rights and humanitarian law. These are, after all, the imperatives of international law. And this is as it should be in Ukraine and in every such case. But what are we to think of the blatantly racist double standard that extends so freely these entitlements to international community to the worthy victims that happen to be white Christian Europeans from Ukraine, but actively opposing them for equally worthy Palestinians, Yemenis, Iraqis, and others? We must call for moral consistency and respect for human rights and international law for all peoples in all cases, because this is the promise of the United Nations, which in the wake of the Second World War committed itself to the struggle for peace and to the proposition that all people are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, let me finish with this. Sometimes in these past 30 years, this work has meant doing advocacy in a presidential palace or negotiating a teak-lined conference room or lobbying in the halls of a parliament. Other times it has meant kneeling in a cholera-infested refugee camp or tiptoeing around the sides of a minefield or collecting evidence in a blood-soaked field hospital or standing knee-deep in corpses in a mass grave, their hands still bound, their wooden faces staring up at you with the horrified expressions of the last moment of their lives, frozen in time. In this work, you learn to recognize the scars of torture and abuse, the bloated bellies of the hungry. You learn to recognize the universal scream of human agony, the universal smell of prisons. But this work also exposes you to the best side of humanity, the courage and solidarity and selflessness, the resilience of people and the capacity for humor even in the face of darkness, the will to resist not just for themselves, but for others. You learn the amazing reality that it is often those who are the most oppressed who have the strongest instincts to be just to others. It is often those with the least who are the most generous, and that whatever is happening in the face of war and oppression and poverty and brutality of every kind, human beings are capable of laughter, of love, of just getting on with it. And all they want is the recognition of their rights and their dignity as human beings. That most things really are universal. That in all the ways that matter, people are really the same in Kiev, in Sarajevo, in Gaza, in N'Djamena, in Phnom Penh, in Papua New Guinea, and yes, in Niagara Falls. Thank you for listening. Be happy to take any questions.
Joan, let me give you the microphone. Yeah, but the people outside can't hear you if you don't use this.
It's okay. So I guess my main question would be, you talk about the war crimes and about being held accountable. So in what way, after hopefully this ends at some point in the near future, which doesn't seem probable, but when all is said and done, what actions are taken to make people accountable for these war crimes?
Yeah. Well, thanks. I mean, that's an area in the international human rights movement that has seen some progress in my tenure in this business, because it used to be that the answer was nothing. There were a few exceptions in history, like the Nuremberg trials. But the Nuremberg trials were victor's justice, right? It was the winners of the war imposed accountability on the losers. There's been a move ever since that time to develop international mechanisms that would apply in all cases of war crimes, crimes against humanity, issues of genocide, and so on. And as a result of that, we have institutions at the international level, like the International Criminal Court, which would be empowered to provide accountability in those cases. There's also this notion of universal jurisdiction, which means that some crimes, some war crimes, crimes against humanity, persecution and others, these are universal crimes that can be prosecuted in the courts of any country. regardless of where they happened. The other possibility, and we've seen examples of this in the wake of atrocities in Rwanda and in the former Yugoslavia, is the establishment of specific international tribunals focused on that conflict and holding perpetrators accountable in those cases through judicial proceedings. I should say, after September 11th, we in the UN Human Rights Office had called for universal jurisdiction accountability for the perpetrators of the crimes on September 11th through that kind of a process. That was rejected, and the world has been at war ever since. We do believe that peaceful means, judicial means of accountability. First, accountability is essential, but the means through which you secure that accountability needs to be peaceful as well. So these are all possibilities. There's also the possibility of Ukraine having its own processes of transitional justice, so-called, where they would uncover the truth, hold trials where it's appropriate within their country. But of course, they're not necessarily going to secure jurisdiction over Russian perpetrators. And that's where international tribunals like the International Criminal Court come in. I'll just say one more thing about that. The International Criminal Court is broadly supported across the globe, and it has been trying even, very, very high level defendants for these kinds of atrocities, and has had a number of important successes. The US opposes the International Criminal Court, refuses to ratify the Rome Statute, the treaty that establishes it, and it has threatened through an act in Congress that if any US perpetrators of war crimes or its allies are arrested and brought to trial in The Hague, the US is empowered to invade the Netherlands in order to stop that from happening. So we have this long-standing problem where the US is an outlier when it comes to efforts at international justice. And I think that needs to change. And I think a part of that is making the American people aware that we're not on the right side of history when it comes to that kind of accountability. You cannot insist on accountability for the perpetrators of atrocities committed by others while saying that you and your allies will not be held accountable. That's not the rule of law. That's simply the old rule of power. Does that answer, Joan?
That's perfect. Exactly what I was thinking. And then you did touch on something else about the Americans' perception of our place in the world. And I think I have had a better understanding of that watching international news, because we get the BBC news broadcast, and that gives a total different slant from what we're used to getting from our newscasts here in the United States.
Yeah, you definitely get that perspective. I mean, I've lived much of my adult life outside of the country, working in international affairs in this way. And you realize there's a very big disconnect between the perceptions that are communicated in media in the United States and the perceptions of others outside of the country about the way that we behave. And I think most Americans want to believe that this is a country that is very committed to human rights and that is a leader internationally on human rights. The problem is when you start to dig in, you learn a number of facts that challenge that perception. For example, the US has one of the lowest ratification records of international human rights treaties. There are 193 countries in the world. 192 of them have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the international human rights treaty that protects children. Only one country in the world has not ratified it. That's the United States, just to give you an example. And the US has systematically opposed much of the international human rights agenda. It rejects economic and social rights, like the right to health and education and housing. It rejects the right to development. It rejects the international program against racism. It rejects the international position on capital punishment because it still defends capital punishment. So there's a whole range of issues that, because I think the American people want to be defenders of human rights by and large. Although I have to say, it's also an idea that's very challenged in the US these days by others who have other ideas, ethno-nationalism and far-right ideologies and so on. But many Americans do want their country to be a defender of human rights. They don't necessarily get the information that empowers them to make that happen.
Here, Peter.
I'm not in any way pointing a finger at the school systems, but they have certainly participated in the non-factual treatments of the historic truths of the practices of this country. And that's just bound to perpetrate the behavior that we have shamefully conducted in this country. I don't know how to reverse it. It's been reversed a little bit. I'm encouraged with what some students tell me is now taught. It's certainly an improvement over what we were taught. It needs to be gone over a lot more.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think education is absolutely key. There's a huge part of the UN Human Rights Program which is focused on so-called human rights education. And it's not just about state institutions. It's about the people. It's about the attitudes that a society holds about these things. And if they're not informed attitudes, because people don't know their own history, I mean, it's certainly true. But I think the bulk of our country people are not aware of the realities of the genocide of the Native Americans, of the enslavement of African Americans, of Jim Crow after that, or of the conduct of the United States abroad. In the Philippines, in Vietnam, in a range of other places continuing up until this day. I think most countries have a similar problem, which is this tendency to want to teach national mythology. George Washington felt guilty about chopping down the cherry tree, and he was a good man, so he confessed, but not the hard realities of our history that would allow us to know what we need to know to make this country better and to make the world better and through that process. So I think you make an absolutely crucial point. Human rights education is absolutely essential. We're approaching the 75th anniversary next year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That declaration wouldn't exist without the United States. President Roosevelt, and even more so, Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, was the chair of the first UN Commission on Human Rights that drafted the Universal Declaration that includes civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, freedom from fear and freedom from want, that belongs to all people everywhere without discrimination. The US can take credit for having helped to bring that about. But we so quickly abandoned that mission after the adoption of the Universal Declaration. And that too is a challenge of education, I think. So I agree with you very strongly.
Before I give up the microphone, I just want to really thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. Thank you very much for being here.
I can't thank you.
We have somebody on Zoom who has a question. Go ahead, Desi. You're on mute, Desi. You're on mute, Desi.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And I thank you, Speaker, for coming to us and sharing your wisdom with us. I live in Lower Manhattan, and I go to Niagara Falls in the summer and fall. So I was a witness to 9/11, and one of the things I've pondered since then, and I would like to hear your opinion on it, is whether as human beings, we have a tendency to war and some sort of natural desire to acquire power to war against each other.
I think that's it. First, I also live in Manhattan and come to Niagara Falls in the summer and Christmas time. So I think we're very like-minded on that, just as we are on, it seems to me that the idea behind your question. And as I said, 9/11 was a crime against humanity. And we had urged that it be treated as such, that we seek accountability through peaceful means, through international criminal cooperation, through a trial that would reveal all of the details of what had happened and then hold the perpetrators accountable, and avoid always rush to war as a solution, because it is a solution. No question about it. And you see that led into decades and decades of horror as taking the path in that case. I think you are right that there is a human tendency toward war. I think there's a human tendency toward tribalism. I think that there are a lot of politicians in the world who like war and tribalism because they can use it to build their own power. People react very easily to these kinds of things. I think there are media actors who are very committed to mining the amygdala, that part of the brain that creates fear in all of us, rather than the part of the brain that deals more with reason. And we see that whenever there is a war or a suggestion of the war, the cheerleading that comes out of the mass media is something that is extremely dangerous in my point of view, unprofessional, irresponsible, and so on. And they're taking advantage, I think, of those human tendencies toward war that Desi mentions. Now, there is also a human desire for peace. That comes especially from those who are living the realities of war. It's lovely to be in the United States, in relative safety, and to be demanding military action over other countries. We've been relatively insulated from those realities. But when you talk to people who are living in war-torn countries, the most profound thirst is for peace, is for an end to the war, is to the return of some kind of normalcy. And we have to amplify their voices, not the voices of the hawks, who happen to be politicians and media pundits. And by the way, query when you hear the kinds of interviews that take place on mainstream media of all of these voices encouraging the war path. Ask, who are these people? So seldom do they reveal that they're people with their own ties to arms manufacturers, to the military industrial complex, who benefit, or the only people who actually benefit from armed conflict. So yeah, it's a human tendency, Desi, but I think the hunger for peace is also a human tendency, and that's where organizing, that's where international law, that's where movements for peace become so important.
Do we have any other questions? Anyone? Yes. Here, let me get the microphone to you.
Am I encouraged? Is that the question? No, I'm a bit depressed these days. I have to tell you, and I'll tell you why. This project of human rights and the international institutions for peace is not very old. We know what the world was like before we had the United Nations and human rights treaties and so on. It was the Second World War and all the things that came before that, genocide on an extreme level, the Great Depression, I mean, you name it, colonialism, mass atrocities of every kind. And this very young project, right? It started, just 15 years before I was born, of building this alternative approach, made some real progress in the decades that followed the Second World War. But we have been on a downward trajectory, in my view, for some time now. And the thing that makes me not encouraged these days is that human rights are very much out of style. There are now other ideologies that are contrary to human rights. They're gaining a lot of support. I mentioned ethno-nationalism, extremisms of all kinds, racism, xenophobia. Those things are garnering a lot more passionate support than the cause of human rights or the cause of peace have been garnering. And it is true that there have always been human rights violations everywhere of all kinds. But what's different now is the very idea of human rights is being challenged. That my tribe is more important, our borders are more important, the markets are more important, counterterrorism is more important. You name it, there are all of these trumps. My race is more important is one of the scarier ones that we're seeing emerge again, and we know where that led in World War II. So it's hard to be encouraged by it. If I am encouraged, it's not because of the United Nations, it's not because of any governments, it's because of growing movements of people in civil society, in churches like this, in social groups and so on, and movements who are stepping up and saying, no, we want to protect the environment, we want to protect human rights, we want to protect peace. And I think that's, if we're going to look for hope, that's where we should be looking.
Being that the Russian invasion is, for the Russians based, at least one of the excuses on the Nazi contingency in Ukraine. I'm wondering, how does the Nazi contingency in Ukraine compare to the Nazi influences in the United States today?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jim, because this rise of far-right ethno-nationalism, fascism, Nazism is a transnational reality at this moment in our life. Now, we have always had these fringe groups in the United States, in Europe, all around the world. The problem is that they are increasingly adjacent to power and to governments in countries around, including in our own, as we know, frighteningly, but certainly in Europe, growing over in recent decades. And that includes, as I said, that includes Russia. Russia is not free of these far-right thugs. The worry in Ukraine is their proximity to power, is the fact that they have actual battalions in the military that are Nazi battalions. They have people who have influence in government and all these kinds of things. It is a transnational threat, I mean, at this moment, you have a growing, let me use the word axis of collaboration between governments that are, that have sympathies, at least, for these kinds of ideas. We had that fear with President Trump here, and maybe we will again. But he was not alone. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Le Pen in France, the new prime minister of Italy, Bolsonaro in Brazil until very recently, ethno-nationalist government in Myanmar, a Buddhist government massacring Muslims there, ethno-nationalist government in Israel, ethno-nationalist leadership in Hungary. These countries are not only countries that happen to have some, let's call them Nazis running around, they're countries that have sympathies for and where those movements are adjacent to power. And that's really what I meant by other ideologies that are challenging the human rights ideology, the human rights idea now. That's a real growing threat to all of our societies, and the fact that they're working together. I participated in the UN conference on migration a couple of years ago in Marrakesh. And one of the biggest challenges we had in the lead up to that was that there was a very sophisticated cooperation going on between these far right groups across borders that were using social media to try to spread disinformation, first of all, but also very xenophobic and racist ideas in order to get members of their parliaments to reject the UN conference on migration because it was based on human rights for migrants. And they actually, in this transnational cooperation, they succeeded in peeling off some countries who withdrew from the conference because of these pressures. I don't think we should pretend that they're just, a bunch of lunatics with sheets on their heads. They are organized, they are influential. And at this moment in history, I think they're a real threat in Ukraine, also in Russia, also in the United States, also across Europe and elsewhere.
Desi, checking the question.
Okay, so I just wanted to respond to the feelings of getting depressed or uncertain or getting fearful, that it's important for those of us who believe in peace. I mean, the way I feel about it is life is dynamic. There's always these forces that hedge against each other, and the desire for peace. I see that strong still. I see what happens in Washington Square Park and Union Square Park almost every weekend. I remember Margaret Mead's saying that it doesn't require masses and masses, but just strong individuals who are committed to the cause of peace. And I also feel what's critically important is that we support each other in our endeavors to keep that belief alive in whatever way necessary. I know that walking down the street, when I see someone who feels the same way I do, whether it's a glance or a nod of the head, that's the inspiration that keeps us going. I don't think either side will ever achieve, like a total static reality, but it's this dynamism that keeps going back and forth. And to know where you stand is the important thing.
All I can do is to endorse every word that Desi just said. Solidarity is so important, and continuing to push against these negative trends from the side of peace and justice and human rights is the duty of everybody who cares about these things, and it does make a difference. So I will share informed optimism, I guess, in that regard. But it requires action, and none of these things are automatic. As they say, you have to be in it to win it. And just passive consumers of information shaking their heads or becoming depressed, I mean, that doesn't do anything to change those realities. The other side is highly mobilized. And that means those who care about peace have to be at least as highly mobilized.
I think we have another question.
Craig, do you feel that the news media in today's society pushes different fractions? And maybe it's always existed, but I think now it exists even more when you listen to the news. Do you see this in the news at all, or am I imagining that what they want you to believe, they just keep repeating and repeating and repeating? We don't seem to get an overall view. We only get a one opinion.
Yeah, I don't think you're imagining anything, Margaret. I agree with you wholeheartedly that is a part of the problem, is the fact that, I mean, that there was, I think the news media was never perfect in this country, as it is not in any country, but there was a time that, most of us are old enough to remember when we didn't have this kind of cable news insanity, where each media company carves out a piece of the demographics that it wants to have on board for purposes of profit, and then feeds them over and over again with the kinds of things that they're most likely to get riled up about. That happens in corporate media, cable media, the networks, and it happens in social media times 1,000 as well. There's no fairness doctrine anymore. That was abolished. There's no Walter Cronkite approach to the sober presentation of the news. That doesn't make money for these companies. And instead we have Fox News on one side just feeding fear and bitterness toward particular groups, and on the other side, I don't know, MSNBC representing a very particular perspective. And there's no common perception of what reality is. There's no agreement on facts. There's no truth. And I think a big part of it too is that the values of reporting have changed very significantly. I mean, nobody is really reporting from the point of view of peace and human rights and justice and equality. They're reporting from tribal perspectives. The one thing they'll all do together is, if the U.S. is at war, they'll give a very chauvinistic presentation from the U.S. perspective, rather than a kind of a whole picture of what's happening with regard to war. And that's from Fox to MSNBC and everyone in between them, and that doesn't help. I mentioned the problem too of war profiteers being brought in as experts, and nobody from the peace community being brought in as experts whenever there's a conversation on this. Just count the number of people who are pro-war and those who are opposing the war when you watch any of these media presentations. There's the problem of media bubbles that people just sort of fall in. I mean, there are people who just watch Fox News 24 hours a day, every day of their life, and their reality is just framed for them by a for-profit corporation with a specific political agenda. What is likely to come out of that, or for any of these media companies? And there are also the areas of agreement between these companies that I think diverge from the kinds of values that we'd like to see in reporting. War reveals this most of all. I mean, I remember the first Gulf War, was it 91, when they kept reporting that we launched X number of sorties. These reporters are basically saying we. And that was when I first became conscious of the kind of chauvinistic approach to the news, rather than an objective portrayal of what's happening, peppered with the kinds of values that you would want people to have in making judgments, human suffering, human dignity, those kinds of issues. So I think what you identify, Margaret, is a problem. And the solution has to be in finding alternative forms of information They're not driven by those kinds of motives, chauvinism or profit, so that people can be informed in a democracy and make the kinds of choices that make war less likely, that make atrocities less likely, and so on.
It amazes me that they get on one topic and one topic only and beat it to death.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyone else? I guess that I had a question. You know, I really appreciate your presentation today. It was just such a wealth of information. It's kind of hard to digest it all in real time because there was just so much there. But I wondered if just to review with regard to Ukraine, you had a very broad explanation of your analysis of what was happening there, but looking towards some sort of solution to it, is there sort of a short form or bullet point type program that you envision that would lead to peace in Ukraine?
Oh, it's a good question, Bill. And I think, step one has to be, if you look at the massive investment in the war, in war that is happening with regard to Ukraine, and you compare it to the almost non-existent investment in seeking a diplomatic solution, you can see where the imbalance is. Whether you judge that in terms of dollars or in effort, even the diplomats, like in our case, the State Department, the foreign ministries of other countries, they've been very focused on building support for the war. It's not just the departments of defense. Rather than having the diplomats looking at solutions, peaceful solutions, they're very focused on building support for the war. And as long as that's the case, you can just see where the balance of influence lies. I said that there is a core of a framework that exists in the Minsk Accords from 2014 and 2015 that lay out some of the root causes of the conflict and set out some solutions, like autonomy in the eastern provinces, for example, and various forms of self-government, neutrality. Really, do we need a heavy militarized Ukraine with NATO weaponry pointed at Russia as a continuous propagation against a nuclear state? Is that really the best thing? Countries have done very well with neutrality. Buffer zones, demilitarizing areas around the border. I mean, there are a whole series of things that have shown themselves to be very influential. We need diplomacy to listen to all the sides of the conflict. We need international law to frame the way that those solutions are ultimately brought about. We need accountability for perpetrators, to be sure. I mean, that's always the case. But we also need to build a path forward of peace. And that doesn't come from just saber rattling and beating the drums of war, as I said, that is all that's happening now. And I think one of the big challenges, if you talk about peace now in some of these places, you will immediately be called an appeaser or a Putin puppet, or these kinds of things. I mean, there are very powerful forces favoring war, and they'll use whatever dirty tricks they can to keep that going. Fine, let that happen, but start the diplomacy, get around the table, talk, use the diplomatic and political resources that we have to work toward peace. And I'm still very frustrated by the experience with Syria, where successive UN diplomats, the most influential, famous diplomats in the UN, people like Lakhdar Brahimi, Kofi Annan, and others, who came forward with successive peace plans to solve the war in Syria. And they were rejected by every single party because they wanted to win. The US rejected them one after another. The Russians rejected them. The Iranians rejected them. The British and the French and the Israelis and everybody that was bombing Israel, because they all wanted their side to win. And they devastated the country. And we lost, tens of thousands of Syrians who were thrown into absolute hell because no side wanted to come to the table where there were solutions. Can't let that happen in Ukraine. We can't let that happen again. There are solutions. there are channels for the peaceful resolution of this dispute. Diplomacy is an option. It will ultimately come to diplomacy because I said all wars end either in total destruction. Well, Russia is a nuclear power. It's not going to be totally destroyed, right? Unless we all are first. So the only other way the war will end is in a negotiated settlement. Let's get to the negotiations now, not later after 100,000 more Ukrainian lives have been lost. I think that's the path.
Well, thank you very much. Any other questions, or comments? I guess we've done it that way, but gee, thank you so much for an outstanding talk today. Wonderfully illuminating, very interesting. So again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody, very much.
I think that I guess we kind of got out of our usual sequence today. Well, that was necessary because it was an unusual program. We were lucky to have a wonderful speaker, and so we adjusted accordingly. But we didn't do joys and concerns. The one thing that I did have. Pam Smith got a hold of me via email and said, would you mention for the benefit of the group that and this has been brought up here before, that Jim Hofnagel talked about the issue of Bitcoin mining and how it uses a tremendous amount of electric power. And that there was a bill pending that has been put through the legislature in the state, but has not yet been signed by the governor, that would put pressure on to basically curtail Bitcoin mining activity using power generated with fossil fuels, which seems to be the method that they seek to use to advance this. And it really is a useless activity. It's just trying to generate profits by warming up and wrecking the atmosphere as a tragic byproduct. So the request that Pam made was, would we announce and remind that please reach out to the governor. I believe that there was an 800 number. But basically that she's accessible online and through various phone numbers, and just reach out to Kathy Hochul to please sign the pending legislation that would put pressure on curtailing the cryptocurrency activity. So that's our announcement on that. Any other concerns or announcements this morning?
Well, I got an appointment one. No, next week is potluck. So if anyone wants to bring anything for a coffee hour, we also have a small coffee hour downstairs after service.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Okay, well, I guess we're done. Again, thanks very much to Craig for a wonderful talk. And I guess maybe Patty will play us out with a little music this morning.
Is this on? Yep. Oh, the weather outside is delightful. Most folks think it's frightful, but if you really love the snow, let's go out and make snow angels.
Thanks, Patty. Yeah, so we're good for coffee and downstairs. Anybody?